It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is Lee Strobel, and we're going to be discussing his brand new book, Is God Real? Exploring the ultimate question of life. Lee, it's always a pleasure to see you. Welcome back to the show.
Well, thanks, Shaun. Great to see you, man. It's been a while.
Well, and that is the wonderful part of being in Christian publishing and interviewing authors is we all write books every 1.5 to 2 years. So the likelihood of getting to see each other, there's a 2 year space there where it's
Right.
very much going to happen. I think the place I'd love to start. Last time we talked about your book, The Case for Heaven.
Yes.
Just as a publishing guy and an author, I'm always curious, is God real the next space for you to put your mind into? How do we get from heaven to the question of is God real?
Well, it's interesting. This is the only book where I was approached by the publisher with this idea. And the reason is the tech people at the publishing house noticed something unusual. They noticed that 200 times a second around the clock, someone on planet Earth is typing into a computer search engine, basically the question, is God real? And when they told me that, I thought, oh my goodness. I mean, if there's that much curiosity, if there are that many people who are sincerely seeking answers to the existence of God, then man, I want to do a book on that. So I dove into it, and this is a result.
Well, if you can own some kind of a keyword or question like that with the book title, I'm eager to watch the sales because you're responding to, I think, a direct question that all of us have. I think as we look at what's happening in culture, a lot of us be like, man, is faith on the decline? Things just feel like they're a dumpster fire. But statistically, according to Gallup, belief in God down to 81% compared to
Right.
98% back in 1967. Why do you think belief has declined? We've seen a lot of shifts in culture, but any root causes you've seen there?
Well, I think you're right. We're seeing these trends of increased skepticism. I think it's driven partially by the internet, by a lot of, frankly, crazy stuff that comes across the internet that I think has caused people to question their faith. I think we live in culturally shifting times that have made people perhaps more skeptical about truths that are seen as being eternal. But at the same time, even though you're right, there is this trend of increased skepticism. We're also seeing some positive trends to kind of offset that a bit. For instance, one poll showed that 3 out of 4 American adults say that they want to grow spiritually. And 44% say that they're more open to God now than they were before the pandemic. And then you look at the Generation Z, which is the most skeptical generation, supposedly the first post-Christian generation, where you have twice as many young people saying they're atheists as in my generation. And yet, Shaun Talbot, who's I'm trying to think of his last name, Shaun Pruitt. You're Shaun Talbot. Shaun Pruitt. I get my Shauns mixed up. Shaun Pruitt, who travels the country and speaks about God to young people, college audiences, high school audiences, he says, I've seen more young people come to faith in Jesus Christ in the last 3 years than I have in the previous 18 years of ministry combined. So we're seeing these dual trends. We're seeing increased skepticism, but increased openness and an increased curiosity about eternal things.
Well, that encourages me because I think on the one hand, we've gone through multiple decades of younger people being told to question, their family of origin, the faith of their family,
Yeah.
and question your country, and just basically being told all the stories you can write yourselves into to know where you stand in the world and where you're going. That's all bad stuff. And so we've just had, multiple decades. I feel like of people just floundering, trying to find
Right.
direction, trying to connect to anything to find meaning. And the reality is, and I think we all experience this in our own life in different ways. If you pursue all of the things that you think are going to make you happy, I don't care what it is, eventually you will come to the end of those things and you're still going to have this gaping hole. And, not going to say the cliche of there's that God-shaped hole in all of us, but God created us as spiritual beings. We long to connect with him. We long to know him. And even if, no matter what you try to fill that hole up inside of you with, eventually you'll get to the end of all that and be like, man, you can have all the money, all the things in the world, but there's still part of you that longs to connect with God. So that's
Absolutely
encouraging direction.
Yeah, and as you know, I was an atheist for much of my life, and I found that personally to be true in my own life, as I was a hedonist, because I figured if there is no God, if there is no heaven, if there is no hell, if there is no judgment, if there is no ultimate accountability, well, if that's true, then the most logical way to live life is as a hedonist, someone who just pursues pleasure. And that's what I did. And yet I found that everything let me down. I was always pursuing the ultimate high. I was always pursuing the ultimate experience of pleasure, but nothing lived up to the hype. Everything let me down. And as a result, it wasn't until I really found fulfillment in Jesus that really changed my values, my character, my worldview, my morality, my attitudes, my relationships, my marriage. I mean, all these things for the better over time.
Well, next, let's get into, I don't know if this is everybody's favorite topic, but science.
Yeah.
Often people will say science, Christianity, they contradict each other, they're
Right.
incompatible. The irony of that is if you know history, there were so many wonderful Christian scientists
Yep.
through the years, especially some of the most foundational scientists. They were able to pursue their craft of science, and they loved and followed the Lord, and they didn't feel like there was a problem with that.
Exactly.
I'd love to have you speak to, in terms of, you know, discoveries, things we've seen happening in science in the past, say, 50 years. Have there been some things that maybe point to that there is a God, that there is a creator?
Absolutely. In the last 50 to 80 years, we've had a series of discoveries in the areas of, for instance, like cosmology, physics, and biochemistry that make the argument for the existence of God stronger than ever in history. In other words, science does not disprove Christianity, it supports Christianity. And one of the great examples is cosmology, which is the origin of the universe. Where did the universe come from? And for centuries, scientists thought the universe was eternal. It was static. It always existed. And yet, because of a series of discoveries over the last 50 years concerning the expansion of the universe and also some philosophical arguments that have been made, virtually every scientist now concedes that the universe had a beginning at some point in the past. And that has resurrected an argument that it was originally formulated by Muslim theologists in the Middle Ages. And it goes like this: whatever begins to exist has a cause. Second, we now know that the universe began to exist. Therefore, there must be a cause behind the universe. Well, then you ask yourself, well, what kind of a cause can bring a universe into existence? Well, it must be transcendent because it was separate from creation, must be spirit or non-material because it existed before the physical world, must be eternal or timeless because it existed before time was invented, must be powerful given the immensity of the creation event, must be smart given the precision of the creation event, must be personal because he had to make the decision to create, must be creative because look at the universe. I mean, look at life. It's incredibly creative. He must be caring or loving because he crafted so perfect of a habitat for us to flourish in. And then the scientific principle of Occam's razor says that there would be just one creator. Well, that's a description of the God of the Bible: transcendent, spiritual, or transcendent, spirit, eternal, powerful, smart, personal, creative, caring, unique. That's a description of the God of Christianity. So here you have cosmology making the case for a creator stronger than ever in history. And then you look at physics. And one of the striking discoveries in the last 50 years of modern physics has been that the numbers that govern the operation of the universe conspire in an unexpected way so that life can exist in a way that defies the idea that could be of merely by chance. And so it's like this: if you go outside at night in the summer and you look up at the sky, and instead of seeing the stars in the sky, you see 50 to 100 giant dials in the sky. And these dials could be set at any one of trillions of possible settings. And yet every one of these dials is perfectly calibrated so that the universe can exist and life can exist. That is the picture that modern physics gives us of our world. And I'll give you one example of one of those dials, and that's the force of gravity. And we all know what gravity is. You drop something, it's going to hit the ground. But if you imagine a ruler that went across the entire known universe, 15 billion light years, broken down in 1-inch increments, this ruler would represent the plausible range along which the force of gravity could have been set. The force of gravity could have been set anywhere along that ruler, and yet it's set at the exact right place so that life can exist. What if we were to change it? What if we were to change the force of gravity 1 inch compared to 15 billion light year width of the universe, all of a sudden intelligent life becomes impossible anywhere in the universe. So, and that's just one of the factors. Some of them are even more profound than that. And so, personally speaking, as a former atheist, if you just give me cosmology and physics, to me, that's enough to convince me that a God exists.
Well, next, let's talk about the resurrection. I mean, that's one of the
Yeah.
things that people like to throw stones at that, saying it wasn't real, it was a
Yeah.
hoax. There's so many intriguing theories that people have put forth through the years to try to disprove the resurrection. And honestly, as Christians, if we don't have the resurrection, we're probably some of the saddest people on the planet because we
Right.
desperately need that as the foundation of our faith. That's where it
Right.
all comes together. Could you give us? I think you have kind of like a 60-second quick summary of evidence for the resurrection, the truth of the resurrection. I'd love to hear that.
Yeah, I'll see if I can do it in 60 seconds. Don't time
No
me.
pressure.
Though,
No timers.
I use 4 words that begin with the letter E because Easter begins with E. The first E is for execution. Jesus was truly dead after being crucified. No less of a source than the Journal of the American Medical Association, which is a secular, scientific, peer-reviewed medical journal, carried an investigation into the death of Jesus. And their conclusion was, quote, clearly, the weight of the historical and medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead even before the wound to his side was inflicted. The second E stands for early. We have early reports that Jesus rose from dead. In other words, reports that came so quickly after the event, you can't write it off as merely being a legend that would take a couple of generations to develop in the ancient world. And so we have a report of the resurrection of Jesus, including named eyewitnesses and groups of eyewitnesses that has been dated back by scholars to within months of his death. That is a news flash from ancient history. Comes too quickly to be a legend. Third, we have an empty tomb. And the strongest evidence for that is that even the enemies of Jesus admitted it was empty. Because when the disciples began proclaiming that Jesus had risen, what the opponents of Jesus said was, oh, well, the disciples stole the body. While they're admitting the tomb is empty, they're trying to explain how it got empty. And so everybody was conceding the tomb was empty. The question is, how did it get empty? And then we go to the fourth word that begins with the letter E, and that's eyewitnesses. You know, most of the facts that we accept as being true about the ancient world are based on one source or maybe 2 sources of information. And yet, for the conviction of the disciples that they encountered the resurrected Jesus, we have no fewer than 9 ancient sources, inside and outside the New Testament, confirming and corroborating the conviction of the disciples that they encountered the risen Jesus. That is an avalanche of historical data.
Well, I don't know if it was quite 60 seconds or longer, but it was good. It was good. Great job. Another thing I'd love to touch on, you've got a chapter digging into kind of profound experiences that people have had with God that have led them to faith. And, you know, depending on what part of the church we're in, some of us are really uncomfortable with people having God. We just like the faith without some of those quirky experiences. Yet people have encounters and experiences with God that in a moment their life is forever transformed and changed. Now we see that throughout scripture. So it really shouldn't surprise us that people have experiences with God today as well.
Yes.
But talk to us about some of the ground that you cover in that chapter. I think it's really important because, again, some church folks uncomfortable with those sorts of things, but it's important to touch on it.
I'll give you my favorite example. Evel Knievel. Evel Knievel was a womanizer. He was a drunk. He was a gambler. He once went to prison for beating up a guy with a baseball bat. He was a bad dude. And, of course, famous for jumping motorcycles over cars and fountains and all kinds of things. So toward the end of his life, he's standing on the beach in Florida, and he said, God spoke to me on the inside. I didn't hear it through my ears. I felt it inside. He said, Robert, which was his real name, Robert, I've saved you more times than you'll ever know. Now you need to come to me through my son, Jesus. And he said it was so crystal clear. And he said, I didn't even know who Jesus was. So I called the only Christian I knew, which was Frank Gifford, who was the famous sportscaster at the time. And he said, Frank, I've had this experience. God spoke to me. Who is Jesus? And Frank said, read the book, The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. That'll explain it all. Anyway, Evel Knievel comes to faith in Jesus Christ in one of the most profound conversions I've ever seen. 180-degree change in his morality, his character, his worldview, his philosophy, his attitudes. I mean, he is absolutely transformed to the degree to which when he was baptized, he looked out at the congregation. He told his story, and he looked at them. He said, "Do you know Jesus? Have you met him like I have? Has he changed your life?" And the pastor ripped up his sermon and said, "You've heard the gospel. If anybody wants to come forward and receive Jesus right now and be baptized, do it." This was a church, by the way, never had an altar call in their entire history. 700 people came forward in 2 services. It was remarkable. And then when he died, about a year later, on his tombstone, at his request, it says, "Believe in Jesus Christ." And so how do you explain this experience that he had standing on this beach that changed his life? And now I didn't have that experience, but even for me, it's encouraging to me to know that God still is in the experience business. And I cite several other examples. Nabeel Qureshi, many people know Nabeel. It became a good friend of mine. Nabeel was a Muslim who became a Christian after researching Christianity, and wrote a book, a great book, called Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. And he had a prophetic dream, a dream about a passage in the Bible that he'd never read. And that was instrumental in him coming to faith. We see this phenomenon in the Middle East, where people in countries where it's closed to hear the gospel are having Jesus dreams, in which Jesus appears to them in their dreams. And there's corroboration of this. They don't just have a dream and meet Jesus and become a Christian. Normally what happens is Jesus will point to someone else who they will later encounter, who will share the gospel with them. Like, for instance, there was a woman named Noor in Egypt, in Cairo, and she had a dream in which Jesus appeared to her, and she was overwhelmed by the sense of grace and love. And she said, "Jesus, tell me more about you." And Jesus said, "My friend will tell you." And he gestured to a man who was walking with them in this dream. And the next day she goes to the crowded marketplace in Cairo, and she sees the man from her dream. And she goes up to him and says, "You were in my dream last night. Same glasses, same face, same clothes. You're the guy from my dream." And he looked at her and said, "Did you have a dream about Jesus?" And she said, "Yes." Well, he was a missionary, and he wasn't planning to go to the crowded marketplace in Cairo that day, but he felt like God had an assignment for him. He showed up, met Noor, and was able to open the Bible and share the gospel with her. So there's this external corroboration. It wasn't just a dream that happened in somebody's mind that you can say is just subjective. There's a corroboration. And this is happening all over the Middle East. And I talk about that in the book. So, these experiences, I think, are profound and exciting. And as I say, even though I've not had that kind of experience, I did have a prophetic dream when I was a child that did come true 30 years later. And maybe that was of God. I don't know. Maybe not. But I'm encouraged to hear these stories, that God is still supernaturally intervening in people's lives today.
Yeah, I just feel like it really is a testament to how much God is pursuing all of us.
Yeah.
All the time. Last time we talked about your heaven book, we talked a bit about near-death experiences, and that's
Yeah.
As a guy who spent the past 4 years talking to people who've had heaven NDEs and hell NDEs, in terms of a lot of times in the heaven NDE, people experience a life review, and
Yes.
one of the things that almost every of those experiencers comes back with is they realize that Jesus was with them through all of the good and bad throughout their
Yes.
entire life journey before they cross over to the other side, and they just didn't realize he was there even in some of the worst, some of the darkest places. And just I feel like
Yeah.
there's so many things that testify to God is pursuing us with a relentless pursuit, even when we feel like we can't see him, because he loves us and he wants to be in
Yes.
relationship with us. So
Exactly.
love those stories, especially
Yeah.
the dreams. And then they have somebody
Yeah.
encountering a person on the street that they saw in their dream, and
I know.
their
Isn't
life.
that great?
I mean,
How much does God love that woman
well,
in Cairo? She's a mother of 5, Muslim background, and he loves her so much that he directly intervened in her dreams to orchestrate her to encounter him for eternity.
what I love is these are things that we see, for instance, in the New Testament, especially in the book of Acts,
Yeah.
where God is moving and things are happening. And so, God is active in our world today. There's
Yes.
absolutely no doubt when we hear these sorts of stories. One kind of stumbling block for folks in terms of, I can't believe in God because, you know, bad things happen. There's suffering in the
Yeah.
world, and again, we're getting to that age old question: why do bad things happen to
Yeah.
good people? If somebody comes up to you and says, the one reason I just can't follow God is because there's suffering.
Yeah.
or bad things? Like, how would you address that? How do you what do you respond? Because I'll guarantee there are people watching and listening to this podcast. This is that one
Yes.
sticking point, this thing that's holding them back from following the Lord. If they had an answer to this question, it could change forever.
Yeah, exactly. I spend the first part of the book building the affirmative case from science and history and philosophy for the existence of God. And there are about 20 lines of evidence that point toward the truth of Christianity. And yet, this is the number one objection. And legitimately so. I mean, my wife has a neuromuscular condition. She's been in pain every day for 20 years. And she will be in pain every day for the rest of her life from this incurable condition unless God intervenes and does a miracle, which he hasn't chosen to do. And so we know what it's like to live with pain and suffering. So how would I respond to that? A couple of ways. I think I would explain that, God has existed from eternity past as God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit in a perfect love relationship. And so love is the greatest value in the universe. The Bible says God is love. And so when God decided to create humankind, he wanted us to experience this ultimate value of love, to love each other and to love him. Well, the only way that's possible is if he gives us free will. And the reason is love always involves a choice. When my daughter was little, they used to have a doll. You're too young for this, Shaun, but they used to have a doll called Chatty Cathy. And Chatty Cathy had a string on her back. And so my daughter would pull the string and let go, and the doll would talk to her. It would say, I love you. That was the technology back then. I love you. Now, did that doll love her? No, of course not. It was programmed to say that. It was forced to say that. It didn't love her. Real love always involves a choice. And so God gave us free will so we could love him and others. But what have we done with that free will? We've turned our back to God. We've hurt each other. And, I can take my hand and through my free will, I can feed a hungry person. Or I can take that same hand and pick up a gun and kill an innocent person. But it's a little disingenuous for me to pick up a gun and kill an innocent person and then say, God, why do you allow suffering in the world? The problem is us. And then, as you say, God is with us in these times. God promises to someday all evil will be judged, all suffering will cease for those that are committed to God and who follow him. And we say, well, why doesn't he do it now? And I like to say, I wrote a novel a few years ago. I've written a lot of nonfiction books. I wrote one book of fiction, which, by the way, nobody ever read. It was a legal thriller. Well, apparently not so thrilling and nobody read it. But it would be like somebody reading half my novel and then shutting it in anger and saying, that's Strobel. He's a terrible novelist. All the plot is unresolved. There are too many loose threads and never come together. And I'd say, wait a minute, you got to finish the book. And you don't read it halfway. You got to finish the book. And God is holding back, the Bible says, the consummation of history, the end of history, because there are still yet some people to enter the kingdom of God. So it's out of his love that he's holding back the curtain to end history so that others might come to faith and he would spend eternity with them in heaven. So I think that every worldview has to wrestle with this issue of pain and suffering. I think Christianity has the best explanation. And I interviewed Peter Kraft, who's a Catholic philosopher at a secular university. I think it's a secular university. It's a powerful interview. I mean, he is profound. And anybody who wrestles with this, I'd encourage them to read this chapter. I think they find it really, really encouraging. And the other thing I'll say, Shaun, briefly is, in a personal way, when people ask me this question, I used to, they say, well, yeah. If God is real, though, what about the suffering in the world? I used to say, oh, well, let me give you an explanation. And I'd give them a 5-point sermon on why God allows suffering. But I don't do that anymore in a one-on-one conversation. I say, let me ask you a follow-up question. Of all the potential questions in the universe, why would you ask that one? And then it gets personal. Then they say, because my wife was just diagnosed with cancer, and I want to know, where's God in the middle of that? Or we lost a child in childbirth 5 years ago. Where was God when that happened? Now we're getting to the real sticking point. Now we're getting to the emotional side, the personal side. And that person is not looking for me to give them a 5-point sermon. They're looking for me to put my arm around their shoulder and to cry with them and to empathize with them and to be Jesus to them in that moment. And so I think, apologetics has its role. Apologetics meaning the evidence for the faith and reasons for why we believe what we believe. But you know what? We can't practice apologetics to the exclusion of personal faith and a personal encounter where we extend the love and grace and kindness and compassion of Jesus to people who really wrestle with this in a personal way.
I think, Lee, the last place I want to stop as we get ready to wrap up the interview is just the idea of how do we deal with doubts. One of the
Yeah,
biggest shame points, I think, for a lot of believers after they start following the Lord is they'll just get into hard places in life, like you talking about your wife suffering with
yeah,
chronic pain. This past year, we've been on a cancer journey with my wife, and it's just, those are the sorts of things that are really the rubber's gonna meet the road.
yeah,
You're gonna be tested on, what do I believe? Is God good? Is God really here? Just in terms of dealing with doubts when we're in those hard
yeah.
places, people are shameful because they feel like it makes them, I'm a bad Christian because I'm having
Yes.
a moment of struggle and doubt. Yet I feel like that's the Christian journey where we're having to go to the mat and find God in these really hard places. I'd love for you to speak of,
Yeah.
is there a healthy and good way for us to deal with those times when we're doubting?
Yeah, I think there is. And by the way, you're right about look at the Psalms. These are many of those Psalms are wrestling. They're laments. They're wrestling with these kind of issues. You've hit on something I think is really important. A lot of Christians are afraid to concede or reveal in a church setting that they have doubts. And here's what happens. When they hold those doubts in, they can begin to erode their soul. But it's like a nightmare when you're a child. Remember when you were 5 years old and you had a nightmare and you wake up and your palms are sweating and your heart's pounding and you're scared to death and you get up and you run into your parents' bedroom and you jump into their bed and they say, "What's wrong?" And you say, "I had this horrible nightmare." And they say, "Well, tell me about it." And you say, "Oh, well, there was a monster under my bed and he had 6 arms and 5 eyes and he was purple." And then you start laughing because you go, "Oh, well, okay." When we talk about it, a nightmare like that, it loses its grip over us. And the same is true of doubts. If you hold them in, they can erode your soul. If you discuss them, if you have a conversation about them, they tend to lose their control over your faith. And you look at Jesus. When John the Baptist got thrown in prison and started to have questions about whether Jesus was the right guy, the one they've been waiting for, he had doubts even. He sent some friends to find Jesus and say, "Are you the guy we've been waiting for? Are we to wait for somebody else?" And did Jesus get mad that John had a question or a doubt? No. Jesus says in Luke 7, verse 22, "Go back to John and tell him about what you have seen and heard. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cured, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is preached to the poor." In other words, go back, tell John about the evidence you've seen with your own eyes that convinces you that I am the one I claim to be. So they do that. But this has not disqualified John from any role in the kingdom of God because he dared to ask a question. It's after this incident that Jesus gets up before a group and he says, "Among those born of women, there's no one greater than John." John, the guy who had a doubt. So it's okay for Christians to have questions. It's even okay to have some doubts as long as we do what John did and we pursue answers. Because today, unlike when I was an atheist and did my investigation many, many years ago, there wasn't a lot of popular level books and videos to help you in that process. Today, there's a proliferation of great books and resources. And so I encourage people, if you have a doubt, crystallize what is the sticking point. Put it down on paper. Here's what's bothering me. Here's what I want to know. And then there are so many Christian resources out there that can walk you through analyzing that issue, I think, in a healthy way. And there's enough evidence, as Jesus told the followers of John, there's enough evidence for us to know that God is real. And might there be some issues that we're going to have to hold in abeyance until we get to heaven and we can raise our hands and say, "Jesus, explain to me, how do Calvinism and Arminianism really fit in? I mean, could you just clarify that?" We're going to have those questions in heaven. And that's okay as long as we have a faith that is well grounded in history, facts, faith, religion, science, philosophy, and so forth. And we do have a faith that is well grounded. And so to hold a few questions in abeyance is not running contrary to the evidence. It's saying, I'm going to take a step in the same direction the evidence is pointing, put my trust in Christ. And yeah, if I don't get satisfactory answers to every single one of my peripheral issues in this world, I'm going to trust that I'll get them in the world to come.
Yeah, it's okay to go through life with a few paradoxes that you just don't know
Yeah.
how to resolve on this side of the veil. And I'll say again, having talked to so many people who've had heaven experiences the past few years, one of the things they all tell me is, A, when you're in God's presence, everything else goes well. You don't care
Yeah.
about any of those questions.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the other side of it is that in once you are untethered from the limitations of your physical body, they talk about that in heaven. There's just a knowing and an understanding. It's like there's no talking. It's like spirit to spirit communication. Like if you
Yeah.
have a question, you just know the answer. And so, I feel like we can have a real confidence that when we go to heaven, all those things are going to be answered in an instant. And again, we're going to be so enamored by being in God's presence.
Yes.
All that other stuff is just going to be washed away.
Yeah,
Lee, in
exactly.
terms of the reader's journey with the book, on the one hand, I go, man, depending on where you're coming from, you're going to probably gravitate to different chapters in terms of what's really going to speak to you.
Yeah.
But somebody takes the time, they close that back flap. Like, what's that core takeaway? Like, man, if every reader gets this one thing, I've succeeded with this book.
I hope the book deepens the faith of believers and gives them more reason to believe what they believe. In other words, this is the why we believe, not just what we believe, but why we believe. I hope it'll strengthen, but I also hope it'll encourage them to reach out to others. I hope, here's my fondest hope. My fondest hope is that when people close the book for the last time, they say, wow, I feel like my faith has been deepened and is more profound and more robust now than it was before I read the book. And I can think of 3 people I want to give this book to. And I hope people give the book away. So many people, I've been signing books recently, and I'd say every other person says, I have a son, I have a daughter, I have a grandson or granddaughter, and they've walked away from the faith. What can I do? And I sign the book and I write a little note to them and encourage them to read the book and to investigate. And, we all have somebody in our life who's spiritually confused. And I hope people, will give this as a Christmas present or a birthday present or something, to think of someone who God might use this book to get them, Shaun, you used the term a sticking point, to get them past a spiritual sticking point that's holding them up in their journey toward God. That's what I want to see.
Well, and I'll say, as a guy who's worked in the Christian publishing space for a decade plus, books legitimately change lives. I get emails and testimonies from authors every week talking about, I got this note from a person who read my book. Somebody came up and talked to me at a conference, and people will take messages that authors write, and God will use them in ways that none of us ever imagined when we were writing the book. And these lives will be transformed, or it'll launch somebody into a whole new sphere of ministry that you never intended that your book would have touched on. So just know that books do legitimately change lives. And I would say too, if you feel like God is leading you to pick up this book and give it out as Christmas presents, don't be ashamed of it. If the Lord's leading you, just press into that and see what God's going to do. The thing I love about this book is you're tackling some of the most core questions that everybody has about their existence, about is God real, and kind of packaged it very nicely into one very, very readable book. And so you don't know what God's going to do. Yeah, it might sit on a shelf for a while. But there's going to be a lonely place, a night when they're like, you know what? My grandmother, my parents, whoever it was, gave me that book for Christmas. The Lord's going to lead them to pick it up and read. And I think their lives legitimately going to be transformed in those moments. Lee, in terms of people connecting with you, finding out more about the book, all the things, where's the best place for us to discover you on the web?
I think if they go to leestrobel.com, leestrobel.com, all the information's there. Our new center at Colorado Christian University, we offer courses fully online, fully accredited, master's degrees, bachelor's degrees in apologetics and evangelism. They can go to strobelcenter.com, or if they just want to take a course on the resurrection or on science and faith or whatever at their own pace, fully online, and get a certificate kind of confirming their completion of that from Colorado Christian University. We'd love to we have hundreds of students studying right now, and we hope to have thousands in the future.
And we'll make it easy like we do with every episode. We'll have links in the description and the show notes to the websites Lee mentioned, as well as links to the places you can pick up your very own copy of his brand new book. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Lee Strobel. Once again, our book today was Is God Real? Exploring the Ultimate Question of Life. And Lee, I want to say thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's been an honor and a pleasure to have you back on the show.
Thanks, Shaun. Love you and your listeners. Thanks for having me.